You'll not be wanted after Michaelmas, Miss Vale. The vestry has voted. Ambrose Teal said it standing, so the whole room had to look up at him. Hester counted 11 men on the benches, and not one of them met her eye. She had taught their children for 6 years. Her salary for the quarter, £4 2 shillings, was already marked withheld in the minute book. On what ground? She asked. Unsuitability. Teal slid a folded paper across the table. The parish is not ungenerous. Marlpit Chapel, and the ground it stands on. Signed over entire. She knew the place. Half its roof had fallen in the year she came. A dilapidation notice was nailed to the door. £11 of arrears stood against it. The vestry had been trying to pull it down since spring. She signed. She had nowhere else, and 11 shillings. That night she carried her box up the lane and stood in the wet nave under open sky. At 2 in the morning the bell rang. One low stroke, then another. Patient as a clock. Hester climbed the tower stair with a lantern. There was no rope. There was no bell. The frame stood in the middle of the ringing chamber with its bolts still in. The hole in the floor where a rope would have run had been boarded and nailed. Dust lay across the whole of it, smooth, undisturbed. She had 2 days left in the schoolhouse. She had not used them. She had walked out with her box while the lamp in the vestry was still lit, because if she stayed until Michaelmas, she would have had to be thanked at the door. The lantern flame leaned toward the stair and would not stand straight. She put her hand into the draught. It was warm, and it smelled of wet stone and something faintly sour, like a cellar after rain. In the morning she went down to Brandreth's for candles, and the shop was full. And she understood before the door shut behind her that it had been arranged. Teal was at the counter with his back to the window. Miss Vale. He turned round with his hat already off, which was worse. I'm glad. I've been thinking about you half the night. That's a great deal of thinking. The offer was £15 and a reconveyance. 4 more than the arrears, he pointed out. And the minute book could be got to say the vote had been on her health. Behind her, somebody shifted a basket. Dinah Loam was at the flour bins and had stopped scooping. My health, Hester said. A delicate constitution is no disgrace to a woman. Neither is arithmetic. You had £4 2 of mine on Tuesday. Now you offer 15 for a building the vestry says is worth pulling down. Why? Charity. Then be charitable to the roof. And leave me the ground. Teal laughed. He was a big-faced man who laughed easily and expected the room to come with him, and most of the room did. Brandreth smiled at the till. 2 of the farmers by the door made a noise in their throats. There's nothing in it, my dear, Teal said. Nothing but clay and a lot of wet stone. You'll be at your aunt's by Christmas. I have no aunt. Then you'll be somewhere. She should have left it there. She had spent 6 years being agreeable in this village. Her father had died owing money in Mansfield, and she had heard what they said about him. At 19, she had decided nobody would ever say it about her. I'll be at Marlpit, Hester said, and I'll open the school in it again. The shop went quiet in a way she felt at the back of her neck. With what? Said one of the farmers. With what I have. You've 11 shilling, Brandreth said, not unkindly, and a hole in the sky. Then it will take a while. Teal put his hat on, and he was still smiling, but the smile had gone somewhere else in his face. You'll want a right-of-way for your carts, he said. The only track fit for a cart runs across my brickyard. Do call and ask. He went out. The bell over the door rang twice, and Hester stood looking at it, because everything in her life was going to be bells now. Dinah Loam came past her with the flower on her hip and said, without stopping, You want to mind him. I know it. No, you don't. Not yet. Hester bought her candles, 4 laths, and a pound of nails she could not afford. She carried them up the lane past the chapel gate and stood in the wet grass, looking at the tower. The bell rang again at 2:10 the next morning. Alderwick Bottom was a stocking village going quietly to pieces. 20 years earlier there had been 90 frames working in the front rooms along the Lean. Now there were 9, and the rest of the men walked to the hosiery at Bulwell or went into Teal's Clay. The chapel had closed in 1846, and the Baptists had gone to a tin building on the Nottingham Road, and nobody had wanted Marlpit since. Hester made her list on the second day, and it did not improve for reading it. Nave, 54 feet, roof off over the eastern half. Timbers down in the grass. The south wall bellied out 2 inches at the eaves, and had been bellying for years. The schoolroom and the vestry at the west end still had slate on them, and 9 broken panes. Graveyard behind. 30-odd stones, waist deep in nettle and dock. A boarded tower. 11 shillings, less what she had spent at Brandreth's, which left 5 and 3p. 11 pounds of arrears, and the collector due in November. She glazed first, because she had the tools for it, and glass is cheap and a room without windows cannot be taught in. Her father had been a plumber and glazier at Mansfield, and she had cut glass on his bench since she was 8. The 9 panes cost her 3 shillings and a walk to Hucknall and back. On the Thursday she went to the vicarage and asked the Reverend Onesimus Bligh whether the parish would let her have the loan of the church ladders. Bligh was 31 and had been in the living 2 years and could not keep still. Miss Vale. Yes. Sit down. Will you have tea? I'd rather have the ladders. Ah. He arranged 3 things on his desk. The ladders are the churchwarden's to lend. Mr. Teal is a churchwarden. The senior one, yes. Then say no. And I'll walk to Hucknall for a ladder. I have not said no. Bligh went to the window and came back. There followed a good deal of unhappy circling, the sense of which was that she had made an enemy where she need not have, and that one small word at the vestry would undo the whole of it. What word? That you had been unwell in the spring. Nobody would have to lie. I was not unwell in the spring. No. Bligh said miserably, I know it. She got the ladders. A boy brought them on a cart 3 days later, and would not take anything for it. And she found out afterward that Bligh had paid the boy himself and told him not to say. The village settled its opinion in the first fortnight, and the opinion was not one thing. Some of them thought she had been hard done by and were sorry. They crossed the road anyway, because Teal took men on at the Clay and put men off at the Clay. Others thought a woman of 29 with no husband and no place was a nuisance waiting to happen. 2 boys came up on the Sunday and threw stones at her new glass, and missed. She caught one of them by the collar on the Monday and made him carry slate for an hour. He came back the week after of his own accord. The bell rang 4 times in October. She wrote each one down on the plaster by the vestry door with a nail. The 10th, at 2:10. The 11th, nothing. The 14th, twice, near midnight. The 19th, once, at 4 in the morning. The 22nd, 3 strokes together, which frightened her more than the silence did. It rained hard on the 21st. She was on the ladder against the tower on the 25th, cutting back ivy, when she found the hooks. There were 7 of them, wrought iron, driven into the joints of the north face at intervals of about 4 feet, running from the ground up past the first stage. Old work. The ivy had grown round them and pulled 2 out of true. Hester sat on the ladder with her thumb inside one of them and did not move for a while. They were pipe hooks. She had made pipe hooks with her father, and she knew, the way she knew the weight of a sheet of lead by looking at it, that these had been driven to carry a pipe of 3 inches bore. 3 inches. The whole roof of that chapel would not fill a 2-inch pipe in a thunderstorm. You did not carry rainwater down a tower in 3-inch lead. You carried a town's water in 3-inch lead. There's been a main up this wall, she said, out loud, to nobody, on a ladder, in the wind. Then she looked up at the boarded slit of the ringing chamber, 30 feet above her head, and thought about warm air coming down a stair at 2 in the morning. Ezra Kilvert had the last frame but one on Chapel Row. He worked it 11 hours a day for wages that had not moved since 1852. Hester came to his door in November for 2 reasons. He was the only man in the village who took no work from Teal. He was also 63, with a bad shoulder, and could not be threatened with anything he had not already lost. She offered 2 shillings a day for 6 days, and told him plainly there would be nothing after that until she sold something. Kilvert did not stop the frame. "What have you to sell?" "Lead. 60 foot of ridge flashing on the schoolroom that nobody could reach. I'll take it down and put a lighter gauge back." The frame stopped. "You'd know that, would you? My father was a plumber." Tobias Vale. Mansfield. Kilvert wiped his hands on the cloth at his knee and looked at her properly for the first time. "I knew a Vale glazed the chapel at Linby. That was him. He died owing." "He did? Well," said Kilvert, "so shall I." He came up the next morning at 7 and stayed until dark. On the 7th day, the 6 days' money ran out and he came anyway. When she started to speak about it, he told her to hold the ladder and not be daft. They worked through November. They stripped the fallen slate off the east end and relaid the schoolroom roof over new laths. She cut and dressed the flashing herself, on a board, with her father's bossing stick and a dresser worn concave by a dead man's hand. The lead she took off fetched £1.4 at the yard on the Bulwell Road. The lighter gauge she put back cost 14 shillings. The 10 shillings difference bought laths, nails, and a stone of oatmeal. On the 3rd of December, the schoolroom was dry. The first person to come through the door for anything but curiosity was Dinah Loam, and she came about a copper. It leaked at the seam. Nobbs wanted 3 and 6 to look at it, and she had not got 3 and 6. "Bring it up. It's built in." So Hester went down to the row with a pot of solder and a bit of sheet. She knelt on Dinah Loam's wet brick floor for 2 hours, and wiped a joint on the copper's feed, and charged her nothing for it. Dinah stood over her the whole time, with her arms folded. "You'll want paying. I'd want a loaf. You'll get a loaf. And I'll tell you what nobody's told you." She crouched down. Teal's father put the last woman out of that chapel and all. Hester kept her eyes on the joint. "What woman?" "Ordish. She built it. My grandmother was taught in it." The rest came out in the flat, unhurried way the row told everything. Nathan Teal had stood up at a meeting in about 45 and said the widow Ordish had had the subscription money off them. She was dead inside the year. The chapel shut. There had been no school in Alderwick Bottom since, except the one the parish kept, which Hester had lately been turned out of. What happened to the money? There wasn't any money. That's the whole of it. There wasn't any, and nobody could prove there wasn't. Where's she buried? In your yard somewhere, under the nettles. Nobody knows. Nobody's looked. Dinah's boy Tom was 9 and could not read. He came up on the Monday with 3 others and stood at the schoolroom door as though it might bite. 6, Hester told Dinah at the gate. No more than 6. Why 6? Because 7 is a school, and a school wants a certificate, and Mr. Teal would have the law on me by Friday. 6 is a kindness. They started with 5. She had 1 bench, a slate bought in Hucknall, and a copy of Mavor's spelling book with the back off. Tom Loam read his first line on the 4th day. Then he read it 11 times over. To her, to the wall, to the other children, and to his mother in the lane, until Dinah told him to give over. In the last week of the month, Hester took all 5 of them into the graveyard with a hook and a rake. She told them they were looking for a stone with an O on it, made a game of it, and promised the winner a penny. Nobody won. But Tom Loam came to her at the end of it, with his hands full of nettle stings. "Miss, there's one been used for a step." He took her to the vestry door. A flat slab was set into the ground at the threshold, worn smooth, and she had walked over it 40 times a day for 3 months. Hester crouched and ran her thumb along its edge. Where it went, down into the soil, she felt the sharp lip of cut lettering. She did not turn the stone over. She wanted to, and she made herself wait. A slab that size wanted 3 men and a bar, and she had 1 man with a bad shoulder, so she went at the building instead. And in December, the building began to talk to her. The first thing was the cupboard in the schoolroom. It was a deal press against the north wall, nailed to the plaster. She pulled it off to get at a damp patch and found a hole behind it the size of a fist. In the hole was the cut end of a lead pipe, 3 inches, hammered flat and folded over twice, the way a plumber closes a dead main. An inch below the fold, punched into the sound metal, was a stamp. M. Ordish. 1819. Hester sat on the schoolroom floor with a candle and traced it with her thumbnail 4 or 5 times. You do not stamp a rainwater pipe. You stamp a main, because a main is buried, and because in 50 years, somebody will dig it up and want to know whose it was. That's a lot of pipe, Kilvert said, when she showed him. Where's it go? Up. There's hooks on the tower. Up to what? That's the question. And where's it come from? That's the better one. She went to the vestry chest at Street Jude's on the 10th of December and asked Bly for the old rate books. He had learned by then that it was less trouble to give her things than to explain why he could not. He unlocked the chest and left the room. It took her 2 afternoons. Marlpit Chapel appeared in the poor rate from 1820 to 1846, assessed at 3 separate items: the chapel, the school, and a wash-house. A wash-house, rated at £4. Struck out of the book in 1847 and never entered again. There was no wash-house at Marlpit. There was no ruin of one. There was a low rectangle of nettle in the graveyard's south corner that stood a little higher than the ground round it, and she had taken it for a spoil heap. There's your answer, Kilvert said. She washed. Whole village washed. With what water? Soft water. You can't scour hose in lean water. It's hard as a brick. He worked his shoulder. Everything in this village was rinsed twice, and it still went yellow. My mother used to fetch soft water. I'd forgotten I knew that. Fetch it where from? I don't know. I was 5. She wrote to Mr. Peachy, solicitor of Fletcher Gate in Nottingham, whose name stood at the foot of the settlement she had signed. She asked who had built Marlpit Chapel, and on what trust it was held. The letter and the copy cost 1 and 4pence, and she borrowed the 4pence from Dinah Loam. Peachy answered in a fortnight. The chapel had been erected in 1819. The trust was understood to have failed for want of trustees. The last surviving trustee of record was Mr. Ambrose Teal. Hester read that sentence at the schoolroom table with her coat still on. Then she made her mistake. The brickyard lay a mile down the valley, and it had a boiler and a chimney. The boiler blew off at the change of the shift. On a still night, the sound came up, the water meadow flattened and low, and you could feel it in the floor. She heard it on the 19th, standing at the gate, and it was so near the note of the bell that she laughed at herself out loud. That's it, she told Kilvert the next day. It's Teal's engine. The sound comes up the valley and gets into the tower, and the tower gives it back at me. Towers don't give nothing back. Church bells hum when a cart goes by. Ask anyone. Aye. When there's a bell in them, said Kilvert. She had an answer for that, and she used it. And she was pleased with it. And she stopped going up the tower. 6 weeks. She spent them on the roof and the south wall and the school, all of which needed doing, and all of which she would have done anyway. None of that made it less than 6 weeks. On the 28th of December, Teal had a notice nailed to his brickyard gate and to the post at the end of Chapel Row. It stated that the track through the yard was private land, that no right-of-way had ever been granted over it, and that any person driving a cart upon it would be proceeded against. It was the only cart track to Marlpit. From that day, everything she needed had to come the long way round the water meadow. Timber, slate, lime, Lead. A load of anything at all by hand, in a barrow, 400 yards through mud. What sent her back up the tower in January was the frost. The whole village froze in the second week. Pumps seized. The lean went white at the edges, and Dinah Loam's copper had ice on it in the morning. Hester climbed the chapel stair on the 9th with a candle, to see whether the boarding on the ringing chamber was fit to keep the weather out. She stopped 4 steps from the top. The stair was warm. Not warm like a room. Warm like the wall behind a baker's oven at midnight. The candle flame lay over sideways, and the air coming down past her carried a smell she had known since she was a child, and had not placed until that moment. It was the smell of a cistern. Wet lead in standing water. She stood on the step with her hand flat on the plaster and said, "You fool," to herself. Twice. Then she went down for Kilvert. The stair was stone, turning left, 31 steps to the ringing chamber. On the 14th step, a stretch of wall about 6 feet wide had been plastered flat, where the rest was bare ashlar. Kilvert put his knuckle to it. "That's later. That's hair plaster. Is it hollow?" He hit it with the heel of his hand. The sound came back short and dead. "It's not hollow. There's something behind it. And it's not air." "How near?" "Hand's breadth." She cut into it with a bolster on the 10th of January, and it came away in slabs. Behind the plaster was brick. She drew 11 bricks out and stacked them on the step, and behind the brick was a door. An oak door 4 feet high hung on strap hinges, with a wooden turn button and no lock at all. "Who bricks up a door with no lock on it?" Kilvert said. "Somebody who didn't want it opened by accident. Or somebody in a hurry." She had her hand on the button and found she could not turn it. "Hold the lamp higher." The door opened inward, into the thickness of the tower. Beyond it, the whole of the second stage had been made into one room. It was a cistern chamber. The tank filled most of it. 8 feet by 6, sitting on stone corbels, built of lead sheet over an oak frame. The seams were wiped, and the corners bossed by somebody who had known exactly what they were doing. The lead had gone white and furred with age, and there was frost in the folds of it. It was 3 parts full of water. "God Almighty," said Kilvert, from the doorway. Hester went round it with the lamp and read it the way she would have read a page. Inlet at the north side, 3 inch. Coming through the wall from outside. From the hooks, a stopcock on the inlet with a squared head, and the head worn bright, which meant hands. A delivery leaving the bottom of the tank and going down through the floor, 2 inch. Closed with a plug. On the east side, a pipe of brass and lead together stood up out of the tank's lid. It rose 8 or 9 feet to a bracket high in the wall. Its top end was flared and turned over like the mouth of a horn. She put her hand on the tank's rim. It shuddered faintly under her palm, the way a full kettle shudders before it sings, when she fills past the lid. Hester said slowly, "The air on top of that water has to go somewhere. There's only the one road out. And that's the bell. That's the bell." Kilvert sat down on the step in the doorway, because his legs had had enough. 22 year, he said. 22 year it's been calling. And we've all been telling one another the chapel's haunted. It hasn't been calling 22 years. It's been calling since about March. She was looking at the inlet. Something's changed up the hill. Something's putting more water down this pipe than it used to carry. The tank's overfilling, and there's nowhere for it to go, because that delivery's plugged. There was a niche in the wall by the stopcock. A foot square. Cut for something. In it lay a box of lead, 10 inches long, made the way her father made a coffin plate, the seams soldered right round. Somebody had cut the solder along 3 sides with a knife and folded the lid back. Hester lifted it out and turned it over twice in the lamplight. There was nothing in it but a corner of paper, no bigger than a thumbnail, still caught under the fold where a hasty hand had missed it. "That's not 40-year-old, that cut," Kilvert said quietly. "That's clean metal. Bethia Slack was 84 and lived in the end house on Chapel Row on 2 shillings a week from the parish. On the 4th of February, the overseers stopped the 2 shillings and offered her the house at Basford instead. Ambrose Teal had been an overseer of the poor for 9 years, and Teal signed the order. Hester heard about it at the pump from 3 women at once. The overseers had come on the Tuesday, and Bethia had not opened the door to them. She was to go on the Friday. At the vestry, Teal had observed that she had cost the parish £9 in the 12-month and could not get to the privy on her own, and he said it kindly. Dinah Loam finished. Which is the worst of him. Hester went down that afternoon and knocked, and had to knock 4 times. Bethia Slack opened the door 6 inches. She was very small and very clean, and she had put her cap on to answer it. "I know who you are. You're the one they turned out." "I am." "Well, you're a fool for stopping." Hester offered her the vestry room. It was dry, it had a fire, and there was a bed in it. She would want nothing for any of the 3. The old woman looked at her a long moment. "Why?" "Because I've been made a present of a building nobody wants. It seems a waste to keep it empty." "That's not why." "No," said Hester. "But it'll do for the doorstep." It cost her more than she had reckoned, and she had reckoned high. It cost the vestry room, which she had been using to keep timber dry, and which had to be cleared and swept and got a bedstead into. It cost 7 shillings a week she did not have, in meal, milk, coal, and candles. By the end of the month it had cost the last of the lead money. It cost Kilvert 2 days, building a chimney breast that drew. It cost her most on the 12th, when Bligh came up the lane with his hands in his sleeves and would not come inside. She had taken a chargeable person, he said, into a property under a dilapidation notice. Hester answered that Bethia Slack had been born in the parish and could be settled nowhere else. That was not the difficulty, and she knew it, Bligh said, and his ears went red. Mr. Teal would tell the vestry she had set herself up as a rival to the parish, and would tell it well. Let him. He will also say that a woman who cannot pay £11 of arrears has undertaken to keep a pauper, and ask where the money comes from. Bligh looked at the gate. That is the sentence that does it. That is the one they remember. He was right. It was said at the vestry on the 20th, more or less in those words, and it went round the village in a day. 2 of the 5 children stopped coming. Bethia Slack, for her part, was no use to anybody for a long time. She slept badly, got up at 4, and moved things. She could not remember what she had said an hour before. She asked 11 times a day whether the door was locked. Twice she got out into the graveyard in her nightgown, and Hester brought her in with a shawl round her. She talked about the past a great deal, and none of it was any good, because it was all names. Chapel had a wash-house, she said one night in March. Out of nothing, with her tea in both hands. Hester put down the file she was working with. Where was it? Where it was? In the corner? By the wall? Where the coppers were? Bethia's face was perfectly placid. Monday you took your things down, and Mrs. Ordish's water was hot by 6. 2 pence the week. There was a slate on the door. Where did the water come from? Out of the tap. Where did the tap come from? The old woman looked at her with great kindness. Out of the wall? My duck. Hester laughed until she had to sit down. Bethia laughed too, without knowing why. And it was the first time either of them had laughed in that room. It was the 3rd of March. The rain came in on the 4th and did not stop for 9 days. On the 8th, Kilvert came up the lane at 6 in the morning and stood in the schoolroom doorway with rain running off his cap. Hester knew from his face before he opened his mouth. They've had the lead off, he said. Every foot of it. Ridge, gutters, and all. They had come in the night with a ladder of their own and worked in the rain, which took nerve. They had rolled the lead and carried it off across the water meadow instead of through the brickyard, which took local knowledge. 60 feet of ridge flashing. Both valley gutters. the soakers round the flue. Hester stood in the wet grass and looked up at it and said nothing for so long that Kilvert put his hand on her arm. "It's metal," he said. "It's only metal. It's 4 months." The schoolroom took water within the hour. By noon there was a stripe of wet down the north plaster, and the new laths were dark. By the 3rd day the room smelled of it. She moved the bench, the spelling book, and Bethea's chair into the vestry and shut the door on the rest. 3 children came on the Monday. 2 came on the Tuesday. After that only Tom Loam came. And he came every day, and sat in a room with 1 bench, and read aloud to an old woman who did not always know he was there. The constable came out from Hucknall, wrote in a book, and explained that lead was very difficult. There was no marking on it. It went to a yard. It was melted by Friday. And after that, it was anybody's. There's a yard on the Bulwell Road had 60 foot of mine off me in November. He'd know his own gauge if he saw it. "I dare say he would," said the constable, and put his book away. She walked to the yard herself. The man there was decent and awkward. A load had come in on the 9th, he said, from a carrier he would not name. He was sorry. He would not say more, and she should not come back. On the 24th of March, the vestry met and resolved 2 things. First, that the churchwardens should treat with the charity commissioners for the sale of the site of Marlpit Chapel, the site being derelict and a danger. The purchaser named was Mr. Ambrose Teal, whose clay workings adjoined. The price was £260. Second, that the sale be put to a full vestry on the 20th of May, with notice given on the church door. Bligh brought her the copy himself and stood in the doorway in the rain again. "Can he do it?" "He was a trustee," Bligh said, or said he was. "He was a churchwarden and an overseer, and he had the only surviving deed." Or said he had. "I looked for it," Bligh added, and swallowed. "There is no deed at St. Jude's. There is nothing in that chest before 1851 except rate books. Somebody has been in the chest. I did not say that." "No, you didn't. That was the worst month. She had 4 shillings. She had no lead, no roof over the schoolroom, no cart track, and 1 child. Bethia had a cough that ran on into April. Kilvert's shoulder gave out, and he could not lift his arm above his chest. He came anyway, and swept, and made himself useless, and would not go home. In the first week of April, Ambrose Teal came up the lane on foot, alone, and stood at the gate. "Miss Vale, Mr. Teal, I'm sorry about your roof. There's a deal of theft about." "There is. £20. That's up from 15, and it's the last of it. You'd clear your arrears, have £9 in your hand, and a character from the vestry saying whatever you liked." She looked at him over the gate for a while. "Why is it worth 260 to you?" she said. "And 20 to me. Clay, my dear. The seam runs under the whole of that ground. I've said so from the start. You've said there was nothing under it but clay. That isn't the same as saying the clay's worth £260. Teal smiled and did not answer. It was the first time she had ever seen him decline to talk. He went off down the lane. She stood at the gate a long while after he had gone. Then she went into the vestry, took the lead box off the shelf, and looked again at the corner of paper caught under its fold. It was pale blue, laid, with the edge of an engraved line running through it. She had seen paper like that twice in her life. Both times in her father's hand. Both times a deed. "Ezra," she said, "how far can you hear a hammer on a pipe?" "Half a mile," Kilvert said. "In lead?" "Further. It carries like a rail." They did it on the 16th of April, starting at first light, because half of it lay across Teal's land. Hester opened the cut end behind the schoolroom cupboard with a saw and put her ear to the pipe. Kilvert went out with a 2-pound hammer, and Tom Loam went with him carrying a stick to mark with. Every 20 paces Kilvert struck the ground once and waited. It was slow, stupid, beautiful work. Where the pipe lay beneath him, the blow came back to her through 3 inches of lead, like a note struck on the edge of a plate. Where he wandered off the line, there was nothing but the thud of a hammer on wet April clay. They tracked it out of the graveyard and under the corner where the wash-house had stood. It went through the hedge at the top of the chapel field and turned northwest up the long slope of Nethercroft, which had been Margaret Ordish's and was now Ambrose Teal's. 940 paces. Tom counted them and got it wrong twice, and Kilvert made him start again. It ended in a stand of blackthorn at the top of the croft, where a spring came out of the sandstone and made a boggy patch that Teal's cattle had poached to soup. There was a mound in the blackthorn with a stone lintel showing through the leaf mold. A rusted iron door stood in it, unopened, in a lifetime, and past the door ran a field drain, cut with a spade within the last 2 years, taking the whole of the hillside surface water straight into the head of it. "That's your extra water," Kilvert said. "That's why she's been ringing." He drained his top field into her spring house. He'd not know what he was draining into. "No," said Hester. He'd only know his field got drier. The lock had gone to rust, and Kilvert took it off with 3 blows. Inside was a chamber of dressed stone, 12 feet by 8, dry above and running below. A settling tank at the back, where the spring came in. Behind a stone lip lay a bed of sand and gravel. A screen of woven brass stood before it, choked solid with 2 inches of black leaf mold. There was a stopcock on the outlet with a wheel head. Along the dry wall, on oak stillages, lay 140 sheets of milled lead, greased, stacked flat. The mill mark still legible on the top one. Hester went along them, touching each one. Then she went to the settling tank and cleared the screen with her hands until the water came through clean and loud. A niche was cut in the wall over the stopcock. In it stood a second lead box, the twin of the one in the tower. This one had never been opened. She cut the solder with her father's knife, sitting on the floor of the spring house, while Kilvert kept watch on the field. There were 4 things in it. A pattern book, quarto, half-bound. It had the pipe runs of the whole system drawn in ink and figured. The spring house, the main, up the croft, the tower cistern, the delivery to the wash house, a delivery to a standpipe on the green that had been taken up in 1849, every stopcock, and every bore. A second book, thinner, of lessons. Reading, ciphering, and the measuring of cloth, written out plain for children who would go to a frame at 11. A printed sheet, folded in 4, from the commissioners appointed to inquire concerning charities, dated 1830. Alderwick Bottom's entry was marked in pencil in a woman's hand, and an indenture on blue laid paper of the 11th of May, 1819. It conveyed the chapel, the schoolroom, the wash-house, the graveyard, the spring in Nethercroft and the way to it, upon trust. It charged the 2 closes called Croft End and Nethercroft with a rent charge of £22 a year. It declared the water free to the inhabitants of Alderwick Bottom for washing and for the trade of the village forever. And it held the property and the rents for a free school in the chapel. They were to be vested in the trustees of the day, and in whoever should then and there be keeping the said school. Hester read it through twice. Then she folded it, put it inside her jacket against her shirt, and buttoned it. "Ezra, Aya, go and stand at the gate of Croft End. Tell me if anybody comes." She had her hand on the wheel of the stopcock. "I want to know how long she takes to fill." The vestry met in the nave of St. Jude's at 7 on the evening of the 20th of May. There were 110 people in a room that seated 60. Mr. Peachy came out from Nottingham on the 4 o'clock and sat at the end of the front pew with his bag on his knees. Teal took the meeting standing, as he always did. The business was short, he said. The site of Marlpit Chapel was derelict and dangerous, and belonged to a private person who could not maintain it. The parish had an offer for the ground. He made no secret that the offer was his own. £260 into the parish chest was not to be sniffed at in a village that could not mend its own road. "Point of order," said Peachy, without getting up. "The parish cannot sell what it does not own." Teal replied that the parish was the trustee. Peachy asked, mildly, "Of what charity?" "Of nothing. There never was a charity." Teal turned to the room and opened his hands. Marlpit never had a farthing of endowment. Old Mrs. Ordish built it out of her own pocket, spent what she had, and left debts. That is all there is to it. "Mr. Bligh," said Peachy, "you keep the minutes." Bligh had gone the color of the whitewash. He stood with the book in both hands and read the minute of the 24th of March, in which Mr. Teal had stated to the vestry that the chapel had never had a farthing of endowment. His voice only got steady halfway through. Teal said he had just said so, and did not deny his own words. "No," said Hester from the aisle. "You never do." "That's what I've been counting on." The room turned round. "In October, you told Mr. Brandreth's shop there was nothing under that chapel but clay and wet stone. In April, you stood at my gate and said the clay seam ran under the whole ground. Which is it? Worthless, or worth £260? Teal began on the ways in which land could be one thing to a farmer, and another to a brickmaker, and the spring at the top of Nethercroft. "Whose is that?" Teal stopped for perhaps 2 seconds. She had watched him for 8 months, and she knew he could not bear a silence in a room he was standing up in. "Mine," he said. "It rises in my field, and it has always been mine." "Thank you," said Peachy, and got up, and began laying things on the table. He laid down the indenture of the 11th of May, 1819, and read the charging clause, the trust for a free school, and the declaration about the water. He laid down the printed report of the commissioners for inquiring concerning charities, 1830. Open at page 209. Ordish's charity, Alderwick Bottom, was set out there with its rent charge of £22 issuing out of Croft End and Nethercroft, and its trustees named. He laid down the poor rate books for 1,820 and 1,846, with the wash house assessed at £4, and struck out. He laid down a letter from the office of the Charity Commissioners, dated the 15th. No consent to any sale had been sought. The board would require an account of the rent charge from the date the closes changed hands. "That is 13 years, Mr. Teal. At £22. 286. The noise in the church went on for some time. Hester did not raise her voice over it. She waited, and then asked one question. "Mrs. Slack, what did you pay on a Monday?" Bethia Slack was in the second pew with a shawl over her knees, and she had not followed one word of the last 20 minutes. "2 pence the week," she said clearly. "And your name went on the slate." At 8:20 the bell rang. It came in through the open door of Street Jude's, across 400 yards of still evening. Low and unhurried. Twice. Nobody in that church had ever heard it in daylight. A woman near the font stood up. Somebody at the back said something, and was told to be quiet. "I shut the delivery at the Spring House at 6 o'clock, Hester said into the silence. "It has taken 2 hours and 20 minutes to fill. If you want to know why a tower with no bell in it has been ringing over this village since March, come up the lane. I'll show you the cistern and the drain Mr. Teal cut into the head of it. 90 of them came." She drew the plug out of the 2-inch delivery in the schoolroom wall at 8:45, with the whole village standing in the graveyard. Soft water came out of Margaret Ordish's pipe into a bucket for the first time since 1846. It was Frank Rudd, Teal's own carter, who said the rest of it out loud that night. He stood at the back of the crowd with his hat in his hands and talked about a ladder and a load of lead carried over the water meadow on the 8th of March. Teal had left the vestry before the crowd came back down the lane. He was off the list of church wardens in July and out of the overseer's room in August. He paid the 286 in the spring of 1869, sold Croft End to do it, and moved to a house in Nottingham where nobody had known his father. The commissioners appointed 4 new trustees in the September. One of them was the person then and there keeping the school. Hester Vale had to sign her own name twice on the same sheet, and had to have it explained to her that this was allowed. The rent charge came in at Michaelmas and again at Lady Day. £22 a year, and never once late. The roof went on over the nave in the summer of 1869 and cost £91. The slate came off a chapel at Linby that was coming down anyway. It was fetched by cart along a track that was a right-of-way again, because Peachy had found it set out in the deed with the width given in feet. There were 140 sheets of lead in the spring house. She sold 60 to a merchant in Nottingham and used 80. The 80 went where Margaret Ordish had drawn them. Gutters, flashings, a patch to the tower cistern's corner, and a lining for the coppers, because the wash house went back up first. Kilvert put the question at the trustees' first meeting. He sat with his cap on his knee in a room of men in better coats and put it badly, and won. There were 40 women in the village, he said, who boiled their water on a Monday over a fire they could not spare the coal for, and rinsed twice, and it still came out yellow. She built the wash house before she built the school. Kilvert finished. It's on the rate book first. That's the order she meant it in. They rebuilt it on its own footings in 11 weeks. 2 coppers, a boiler, 4 troughs of soft water off the tower, and a slate on the door for the names. Dinah Loam ran it at 9 shillings a week, kept the slate herself, and would take nothing from anybody over 70. The school opened on the 11th of October 1869 with 53 children on the books. It was called Ordish's Free School, because it always had been on paper, and nobody had read the paper for 23 years. Hester taught reading and ciphering in the mornings. In the afternoons, she taught 11 of the older ones to cut and dress lead, wipe a joint, and glaze a sash. She taught it out of her father's tool bag and out of Margaret Ordish's pattern book. In the second year, 2 of them went to a plumber in Bulwell on indentures, and one of the 2 was a girl, and there was a great deal of talk about it. Ezra Kilvert brought his frame up to the east end of the nave and worked it there. He taught the boys the trade with one arm and his mouth, and told them exactly what it was worth and why they should learn something else as well. Onesimus Bligh preached against the wash house in November, on the ground that the Sabbath was being eroded from the Monday end. He also christened Dinah Loam's grandchild in the chapel yard, when the parish register would have made a difficulty of it. He never referred to either occasion again. Bethia Slack died in the vestry room on a Tuesday in March 1870, in her own bed, with the fire drawing. Hester was in the room. They turned the slab at the vestry door over that spring. It took Kilvert, 2 of the Loams, and a bar. Underneath, filled with 60 years of grit and perfectly sharp, was Margaret Ordish, widow, 1782. 1846. Beneath that, in smaller letters, this water is the parish's. They set her up against the south wall, where the sun got to her by 10 in the morning. Hester never found out who had cut the solder on the lead box in the tower, and after a while, she stopped wanting to. Nathan Teal had died in 1858. His son had said one true thing in 8 months, which was that there was clay under the ground, and there was. The tower still rang. It rang when the sand wanted turning, or when the brass screen at the spring house choked with leaf, which in that valley meant every October and after any hard rain. The children knew what it meant before they could spell it. They were told on the first morning, along with where the privy was. On a Monday in June 1870, the yard behind the wash house held 19 women and 4 coppers going, with steam standing over the whole of it in the sun. The note came down the valley at 11 o'clock. Lo, twice, Tom Loam was 13 and had a mouth on him, and he was up on the wall before anybody else had lifted a head. "She's full," he shouted, across 19 women and 4 coppers in the whole of the graveyard. "Who's shutting the cock then?" "You are," said his mother, "since you've the wind for it." He went up the lane at a run. The women went back to their washing. Hester Vale stood in the washhouse door with her sleeves rolled and listened to the note die out over the roofs of a village that had once let her buy her own candles in silence.